6 A-C-T-E-R-I-S-T-I-C-S of the last days. Alright, so 6 characteristics of the last days. So again, it's as I said, it's a simple narrative to follow once you have an understanding of sort of how the narrative is constructed, right? And I don't mean narrative in a fictional sense. I just mean narrative in sort of the way in which we make sense of the events that have occurred, right? We make sense of these historical events through discourse, through narrative. The idea is God decided to create a kingdom for his chosen people, the Jews. The Jews, however, rejected him. That rejection led him to seek out new people, a new church. He does this and locates it in the Christian church. The Christian church then is set with the task of really number 6, right? We're in number 6 now, is the attempt to sort of establish the church. The church is being established. We don't know when the church is going to edify, satisfy the desire of God. And once it does, God will rapture the whole church. And then the last days happen, right? It's at this point that we need to make sense of exactly what the last days are. As you can, oh, I didn't write it down. Last days. Oh, I did. Last days. The last days speak of, obviously, an end time. Right? The last days speak of the end time, right? And this is where we really have a sense of, to be technical, the relationship between eschatology, specifically eschatological postponement theory, and its relationship to dispensationalism. You see that it's impossible really to separate the two. You can't conceptually, and I'll think about this for a second, but you can't conceptually separate dispensational premillennialism from eschatological postponement theory. And the question is why? This would be a good, like if I were teaching this in class, this would be a good midterm question, or exam question. What is the conceptual nature of the relationship between eschatological postponement theory and premillennial dispensationalism? Right? It's a mouthful. It's a mouthful. What's the conceptual relationship between eschatological postponement theory and premillennial dispensationalism? Right? The idea is the postponement theory gives us the narrative. Right? From postponement theory, you get the narrative of God's rejection and the new church and the rapture. From the dispensational premillennialist theory, we get the role of the millennial, number 6 and number 7, the church and the millennial, right? But the millennial being the final state, the second coming of Christ, the rapture, establishment of the church. So we see that the millennial dispensation accords with the eschatological postponement theory in terms of the last days, the events that lead to the grand destruction, really, of humankind, right? It's like, in a sense, a cleansing, right? A purging, a purgation, right? It's a cleansing. So very, very technical. And in preparing the rest of the notes, I'm only going to do this section and then I'll stop. I have more here, but I'll stop. I'll vibe cyberspace to see the level of complexity, and either continue where I am or slow down a bit. Okay, so the first is the Great Tribulation, right? The recognition, and this can be accounted for in many different ways, but the recognition that the end time is near, right? That we are approaching a historical state, right? In time, real time, our time now, 2012 and on, that conditions, remember what I said about premonitions, right? With the example with the person who travels to work daily and gets this premonition. I get a sense, right? I get a sense that we are in the end times, and that tribulation is about to, trials, they always put the two words together, right? Trials and tribulations are about to sort of unfold. And the greatest unfolding of this, obviously, is the most villainous character in all of Christendom, aside from Satan himself, is the Antichrist, which is number 2, right? So the reign of the Antichrist, right? The reign of the reign of the Antichrist, right? And Nietzsche has a text with Antichrist in the title. It doesn't really have to do with Antichrist per se, but the reign of the Antichrist, right? If Christ is the source for all that is just and good, because we saw in fundamentalist theory and theology that the rightness of an action is contingent on God commanding it, then the Antichrist is just the opposite. Everything that the Antichrist commands is wrong. And it's wrong because he commands it. So if you think of sort of Christ, right, as being the good guy, I'm just trying to be sort of clear here, and the representation for a fundamentalist is this: an action's rightness is a consequence of God's command, right? And I explained that earlier. Then, if you think about the bad guy, or what's evil, right, the Antichrist, then the Antichrist can only command things which are wrong. Right? This action is right. This action is wrong. And why is it wrong? It's wrong because everything that the Antichrist tells you to do is bad. Everything. Anything. Devotees who truly believe that this figure is the Antichrist, right? If the figure is labeled as such. And I would imagine that there would have to be some consensus. I don't know how we would, and this is open for discussion. I also want to learn some new stuff too, right? So if you have a really good understanding of this, I don't understand conceptually, this is not a knock, but I don't understand conceptually how an individual would be identified as the Antichrist, right? Because we're talking about historical progression, and we recognize that we can't definitively talk about the last days without there being, I would imagine, an identifiable Antichrist. Unless the Antichrist is, I don't know the religious tradition enough to know if the Antichrist is, I think the Antichrist reveals himself, right? As the Antichrist. How would we be able to know that that is in fact the Antichrist? That's just me asking, anybody. Just, I don't know. But what I do know, conceptually, is that no matter what, since the Antichrist is anti-Christ, it's opposite, it's an antithetical force to Christ, polemically speaking, good on one side, bad on the other side, all good on one side, all bad on the other side, then everything that the Antichrist commands is wrong. Anybody who follows anything that the Antichrist says is participating in an act of wrongness and an act of evil, what have you. Okay. The battle for Armageddon, obviously, this direction towards an end state culminates in the end of everything, including war. Right? This is going to be the last war. This is going to be the last battle. And you can imagine that since we are approaching a time, both theologically, theoretically, and historically, since we're approaching a time, specifically historically now, where this is the end time, the last days, then the last battle is going to be a humongous battle. It's going to be the last battle ever. So this is going to be a battle of sort of epic proportions, and the title for the battle, as given in the Christian tradition, is the Battle of Armageddon. What I'll do is, throughout the series, I'll talk about various discourses on battle. And on battle specifically with respect to an eschatological interpretation of how that battle, one, manifests, how it unfolds, and who the victor is, right? So we'll look at it from a fundamentalist perspective. We'll look at it from a liberal sort of Christian perspective. We'll look at it from an Islamic perspective, a Judaic perspective, a Hindu perspective, and so on. Then the binding of Satan. I'm not going to get into that too much. Satan is bound. That's part of the religious belief system. Number 5, quote, the establishment of the millennial kingdom when most of Israel will be converted to Christ. So you can think about the story now, right? God engages his people to create a kingdom for them. They reject him. He then turns his attention